On December 25, 1776, Colonel Johann Rall sat in a warm headquarters in Trenton, New Jersey, commanding 1,500 of the finest professional soldiers in Europe. Rall expected nothing tonight. No army, he believed, would cross a half-frozen river in a blizzard to attack a fortified town defended by veteran troops. What Rall's garrison encountered instead was a fleet of ordinary cargo boats, crewed by fishermen, carrying an army that should not have been able to move at all, a force the professionals had already written off as finished. So how did 2,400 starving, barefoot soldiers cross an ice-choked river at night and destroy a professional garrison twice as confident as it had any right to be? To understand why this crossing happened at all, you have to understand how close the American Revolution was to simply ending, not in defeat, but in dissolution. By December 1776, George Washington's army had been beaten out of New York City, chased across New Jersey, and gutted by a string of disasters. The fall of Fort Washington alone, on November 16th, had cost nearly 2,800 men captured in a single afternoon. Washington's force, which had numbered close to 20,000 soldiers earlier that year, had shrunk to somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 men still fit to fight. Desertion was constant. Morale, by every surviving account, had hit its lowest point of the entire war. And there was a second deadline closing in, one that had nothing to do with the British at all. Most of Washington's remaining enlistments expired at midnight on December 31st. In 6 days, regardless of what happened on any battlefield, a huge portion of the Continental Army would simply cease to legally exist. Men would walk home, not because they were defeated, because their contracts ran out. Washington was not facing one enemy. He was facing two clocks running at once. The British Army in front of him and the calendar behind him. And the calendar was faster. Congress itself had been forced to flee Philadelphia for Baltimore that same month, expecting the city to fall. British and Hessian forces held a chain of outposts across New Jersey, and enough of them had already settled into winter quarters that the campaigning season was widely assumed to be over until spring. From London's perspective, and from the perspective of most professional officers in the field, the war looked close to finished. Not because of one dramatic defeat, but because of an accumulation of smaller ones that had ground the Continental Army down to almost nothing, and a broader assumption that no rational commander would even attempt an offensive in the dead of winter. The tool that would decide everything wasn't a new weapon. It wasn't even designed for war. The Durham boat was a flat-bottomed cargo vessel built to haul pig iron and grain up and down the Delaware River. Sturdy, simple, and completely unglamorous. Nobody had ever imagined it as an instrument that could decide the fate of a revolution. It was a freight boat, and in early December, Washington had ordered every single boat like it for 75 miles along the river seized or destroyed. Not to use them yet, but to strip the British of any way to follow him across. That decision would matter more than anyone realized at the time, because the men who actually knew how to handle a boat like this in dangerous water weren't soldiers at all. They were fishermen. Specifically, they were the men of Colonel John Glover's 14th Continental Regiment, mariners from Marblehead, Massachusetts, many of them lifelong sailors, some of them Black and Native American crewmen serving in a regiment that looked nothing like the tidy, uniform image most people picture when they think colonial militia. These weren't theoretical boatmen. Just 4 months earlier, in August 1776, this same regiment had quietly rowed Washington's entire defeated army, nearly 9,000 men, across the East River at night, right out from under the nose of the British fleet after the disaster at Long Island. It's one of the least known evacuations in American military history, and it's the reason anyone trusted Glover's men with an even harder crossing that December. The British High Command and the Hessian officers garrisoning New Jersey dismissed the entire idea of a winter river operation almost contemptuously. Why wouldn't they? A cargo boat crewed by fishermen moving an exhausted, half-starved, badly supplied rebel force across ice in the middle of a storm at night was not a military plan by any conventional European standard. It was closer to a fantasy. That dismissal is exactly what made it possible. There was nothing about a Durham boat's design that suggested military significance. It had no armor, no speed, no weaponry of its own, just a flat hull built to carry heavy freight in shallow water without capsizing. Under normal circumstances, nobody would have looked twice at one. But that same flat-bottom simplicity was precisely what let it carry horses, men, and 18 pieces of artillery through ice that would have torn apart a more delicate vessel. The boat's only real advantage was that almost nobody thought to take it seriously as a tool of war. And that blind spot is exactly where Washington and Glover chose to operate. Washington understood something the professional armies around him refused to accept. An army doesn't only die from bullets. It dies from paperwork, from expiring contracts, from a calendar nobody's watching. Waiting for a safer moment to attack meant guaranteeing there would be no army left to make the attempt at all. And Glover's mariners understood something the Hessians never considered: that a boat's danger in ice isn't about the boat. It's about who's holding the oars. That single insight, that the crossing was a matter of skill, not equipment, is what turned a freight boat into the most consequential vessel of the entire war. Here's exactly how Washington tried to make the impossible happen. The plan called for 3 simultaneous crossings of the Delaware River on the night of December 25, 1776. Not one. Washington's own column, roughly 2,400 men and 18 cannon, would cross at McConkey's Ferry in Pennsylvania and land at Johnson's Ferry on the New Jersey side, then march roughly 9 miles south to Trenton. A second column, under General James Ewing, was supposed to cross directly opposite Trenton itself, to block the Hessian retreat route south. A third column, under General John Cadwalader, was to cross further downriver at Bristol, drawing off a separate Hessian post and threatening Trenton from another direction entirely. If all 3 had worked, Trenton would have been surrounded from 3 sides before dawn. At McConkey's Ferry, the operation began in the late afternoon, around 4 to 6 p.m., as a nor'easter rolled in, sleet turning to snow, temperatures dropping, wind picking up, and the river itself increasingly choked with floating ice, some of it in slabs large enough to stove in a hull if a crew misjudged the current. Glover's men loaded soldiers, horses, and 18 pieces of artillery into the Durham boats, pushing off in relays through the dark, fighting the ice the entire way. Henry Knox, a former Boston bookseller turned self-taught artillery commander, personally oversaw the guns, the single heaviest and most fragile part of the entire operation. One capsized boat, one miscalculated current, and the artillery Washington was counting on to break the Hessian defense would be at the bottom of the Delaware. The crossing that was supposed to take a few hours took closer to 9. By the time the last boats reached the New Jersey shore, it was roughly 3 a.m., hours behind schedule, with a 9-mile march to Trenton still ahead of freezing, exhausted men, many without proper shoes. And 8 miles and 20 miles downriver, the other 2/3 of Washington's plan had already collapsed completely. Ewing's column couldn't get boats across the ice at all. Cadwalader's column got some infantry across, but couldn't move the artillery and pulled back. 2 of the 3 planned crossings never happened. Trenton would not be surrounded on 3 sides. It would be attacked by one exhausted column, alone, hours later than intended, or it would not be attacked at all. Washington pushed forward anyway, splitting his single column into two divisions along different roads, one under General Nathaniel Greene along the Upper Pennington Road, one under General John Sullivan along the Lower River Road, so that both could hit Trenton from two directions at roughly the same time, even with everything else in the plan already broken. Every part of the march that followed was designed around timing that no longer existed. The original plan depended on darkness to cover the final approach. By the time the columns were moving, the storm had slowed everyone down so badly that Washington was racing not the enemy, but daylight itself. Officers were under orders to keep the two columns roughly level with each other, so that neither would arrive alone and be cut apart in the open. A coordination problem that's difficult enough on a clear day with fresh troops, and considerably harder with exhausted men slipping on ice in the dark, some of them marching with rags instead of boots. On the other side of the river sat the man who was supposed to make all of this irrelevant.
Colonel Johann Rall had built his reputation on aggression. He had personally led the assault that overran Fort Washington just weeks earlier, one of the worst American defeats of the war, and it had made him confident to the point of carelessness. Rall considered fortifying Trenton beneath him. Why dig in against an army that, by every rational measure, no longer had the strength to attack anyone? His own officers reportedly urged him to build defensive works around the town. He didn't. Rall commanded 3 regiments of Hessian regulars, professional soldiers, well-drilled, well-armed, garrisoned in a town his side controlled completely. In his mind, the weather wasn't a variable to plan around. It was a wall that did the work for him. No rebel army, half-starved and unpaid, was crossing a river choked with ice in a snowstorm to attack a defended town at dawn. It simply wasn't something armies did. That single assumption, that the storm was on his side, is the exact assumption Washington's crossing was built to punish. By roughly 8 a.m. on December 26th, hours later than planned, in daylight instead of darkness, Greene's and Sullivan's columns converged on Trenton from 2 directions at once. The Hessian outposts on the edge of town, half frozen from a night watch in the storm, spotted the advance late. Muskets that had been carried through hours of sleet and snow were in places too wet to reliably fire. General Sullivan reportedly sent word back that his men's powder was soaked. Whatever the exact reply, the message was clear. There was no time to wait for dry weapons. The bayonet would have to do the work instead. Henry Knox's artillery, the guns that had nearly been lost in the river crossing 9 hours earlier, was wheeled into position at the head of Trenton's 2 main streets and began firing directly down them, tearing into any formation the Hessians tried to form in the open. Rall, woken to the sound of gunfire in his own town, scrambled to organize a response, trying to rally his regiments in the street rather than behind any prepared position, because there was no prepared position. Within minutes, the same overconfidence that had kept Trenton undefended turned the town's open streets into a killing ground, with nowhere for his men to take cover. Rall himself was shot from his horse, trying to rally a counterattack, mortally wounded. Without fortifications, without warning, and now without their commander, the Hessian garrison began surrendering in the streets in groups, some throwing down their weapons within the hour. A professional force that had crushed American positions weeks earlier at Fort Washington, unraveling in the space of a single confused morning. The entire battle, the culmination of a 9-hour river crossing, a 9-mile freezing march, and an assault launched hours behind its own schedule, was over in under 2 hours. Here are the numbers, and historians still double and triple check them because they sound almost fabricated. Roughly 22 Hessians killed, including Rall himself. Somewhere between roughly 896 and 918 Hessian soldiers captured, nearly the entire garrison. On the American side,
No soldiers killed in the fighting itself. A handful wounded, including a young lieutenant named James Monroe, shot through the shoulder. The same James Monroe who would become the 5th President of the United States. The only fatalities Washington's force suffered that entire operation were 2 men who reportedly froze to death during the march before a single shot was fired. An army that had just crossed a half-frozen river in a snowstorm marched 9 miles on frost-bitten feet and attacked hours behind schedule in broad daylight had just captured almost an entire professional European garrison while losing effectively no one in combat.
It is, by any conventional military logic, a result that shouldn't have been possible, which is exactly why it's still being cross-checked against Hessian and American records 2.5 centuries later. The victory at Trenton didn't win the war, but it changed what the war was allowed to be. Word of the win spread through the colonies within days, at exactly the moment Washington needed it most, while he was trying to convince exhausted, unpaid soldiers to re-enlist past their December 31st deadline. Offered a cash bounty and, more importantly, proof that the Army could still win, a critical mass of soldiers stayed. A week later, Washington struck again at Princeton, extending the momentum and forcing British forces to abandon much of the New Jersey territory they had just spent months securing. Historians call these 9 days, from the crossing through Princeton, the 10 crucial days, and they are widely regarded as the moment the Revolution stopped dying and started surviving. There's a parallel worth holding up here, from a completely different century and a completely different war. In 1940, at Dunkirk, a defeated, encircled army was saved not by a superior weapon, but by ordinary boats, fishing trawlers, pleasure craft, civilian vessels, crewed by people who simply knew how to handle a boat in dangerous water. The parallel isn't exact. Dunkirk was an evacuation and Trenton was an attack, but the underlying mechanism is the same. An army on the edge of collapse, saved by unglamorous boats and the specific, unglamorous skill of the people rowing them, not by any weapon anyone would have called impressive on paper. That's the transferable lesson underneath this entire story. The side that wins isn't always the side with the better weapon. Sometimes it's the side willing to trust an unglamorous tool, a freight boat, a fisherman, a calendar deadline nobody else is taking seriously, in the hands of the one person who actually understands how to use it. Today, the crossing point itself is preserved on both sides of the river, Washington Crossing Historic Park in Pennsylvania and Washington Crossing State Park in New Jersey. Quiet, wooded riverbanks where every Christmas Day, volunteers still reenact the crossing in replica Durham boats. The original boats don't survive. Nothing about the site looks dangerous anymore, which is, in its own way, the point. The river that nearly ended the Revolution and the boats that saved it instead are now just a calm stretch of water that most people driving past would never look at twice. If you're the kind of person who actually wants to understand how impossible military situations got solved, not just what happened, but how, this is exactly the kind of forgotten tactical history we dig into every week on this channel. Stick around.